Hello learners, welcome to the course Ecosystem and Natural Resources, course code MHD012, and we have been learning about different topic related to agrobiodiversity, block 4, right? And in this session our main major focus will be on promoting agrobiodiversity, its challenges, right? We have seen in today's development and especially in agriculture policy that confront the difficult challenges to meet the demand of over 6.5 billion people around the world. And this can be projected to grow up to 9 to 10 billion by 2050. This was that in order to meet the increased demand for food and fiber. So to produce more food and fiber, we may need more land that would be converted to agriculture, and agricultural intensification would continue and continue. So this kind of processes to meet increased demand for food and fiber, that is placing growing pressure on agricultural landscape, thereby leading to unprecedented loss of agrobiodiversity, and its services. So there is a need for a continued integration of international agricultural markets and the pressure from the agribusiness sectors to shape agricultural landscape into a more simplified and apparently manageable sector that are also one of the emerging as potential that particular this agribusiness is one of the potential threats to agrobiodiversity. So looking into this background, we need to understand the implication of the way of economic development or economic growth on agrobiodiversity. We need to understand today we have seen or we have evidence with a number of genetically modified group, as we call genetically modified organisms like genetically engineered crops. And we need to understand the impact of genetically engineered crops on agrobiodiversity. And moreover, we know that whatever we are able to preserve our culture of traditional land resources, all these are because of the role played by our traditional knowledge. So we need to recognize the significance of women, traditional knowledge, and participatory breeding for agrobiodiversity conservation. So today in this session, we'll have a quick look into the pattern of economic development and how it is impacting to agrobiodiversity. And we need to look, now we have seen that during the last few decades that we are transition of agriculture is from traditional to intensive agriculture. In the same time, we are adopting a number of genetic engineered crops in our field. So we need to understand the impact of those genetic engineered crops, and then when we realized different issues and challenges because of from traditional to intensive agriculture, and again by introduction of many then high yielding variety. And all these things, now we have to understand how to sustain our agriculture. And for sustaining our agriculture, we need to understand what is the role played by agrobiodiversity. That's we are looking in this session. So we need to understand the integration of ecological economic perspective about the value of agrobiodiversity. When we talk about the current pattern of economic development and agrobiodiversity, as we know that present human society, we are living in the age of rapid ecological, social, and economic changes. And the pace of these changes, it is going to be accelerate next another few decades, or it will be going on and going on, right? And we know that in the same time, whatever happening is because of the growth in population, human population. It is also projected to be around 9 to 10 billion by 2050. And so by 2050, if our population increases, then automatically there will be food consumption will be double to meet human needs, right? So to meet all this increasing demand for food and fiber because of the increasing human population, the production systems are expected to become increasingly dependent on outputs or inputs of fertilizers, pesticides and water. So this implied that more land would be converted to agriculture and agriculture intensification would continue, right? So at the same time, because of that, we use different methods, and we are expanding our lanes, irrigated lanes, and in that phase, we are going in this line that irrigated lanes is expected to increase by 1.9 folds by 2050. At the same time, pasture lanes are also increasing with an expected doubling in area by 2050. So in another 50 or so years, global agricultural lands area is expected to increase by 18%. When it is increases, there is a loss of hectares of and more than 109 hectares of natural ecosystem. So this process, in this process, it is giving so much pressure on agricultural landscape. When it is giving so much pressures on agricultural landscape, that promote species extinction in many unconstricted wildland habitats. At the same time, abandonment of already degraded that fragile land and agricultural encroachment forest margin would most likely to increase. That will again further loss of agrobiodiversity in services. So added to this is the continued integration of international agriculture. We know that that international agriculture market and the pressure from the agribusiness sector to shape agricultural landscape to a more simplified and thus in this way apparently manageable sector at an ever accelerating pace, especially in developing countries. This is also one of the challenges we are facing in front of us. So when we talk about because of that agribusiness, then we know that simplifying that agricultural landscape means simplifying agrobiodiversity. This will translate it into disinvesting in natural capital and thus increasing the risks of already volatile agricultural commodity market. So industrial countries with a highly developed financial sector, they may be able to substitute natural financial capitals to some extent. But when in case of developing economies, when this financial market exists, they are often rudimentary and incapable of ensuring farmers against simplifying choices. So we need to manage a portfolio of capital without proper insurance mechanism, well-functioning market, which is such kind of managing that portfolio of capital without proper insurance mechanism and without well-functioning market, that will become a risky business in the future. Coming to genetic vulnerability, because of all these processes, the activities done by us, that genetic vulnerability of our ecosystem is also one of the important aspects of our economic development. We know that. So such kind of genetic vulnerabilities of today's global agricultural system arises from a common dependence on relatively few more crops and varieties. Now each year, if you look into some of the figure, you will find out that each year crop damages penalizes farmer in many of the world villages. And for farmers who depend on their crops for their livelihoods, this particular penalties, that because of all this process that become their consequences, such as liquidation of acids, migration, and nutrition, right? And when we follow the intensive production system, about the incidence of pests and the plant diseases and the potential for large scale epidemic, they are higher. Because of the intensive production system, that frequency of those incidents will be high. Then, combating plant diseases epidemic, when we have faced such kind of epidemic, then combating such kind of plant disease epidemic, they incurs cost for nations. And if you look into a higher scale, that all this trap for funds, and this can involve unsafe use of chemicals sometimes. We are using chemicals as pesticide and so on to fight all those epidemic, right? So coping with this with persistent crop damage and avoiding disaster, epidemic through maintenance of breeding instead of chemical controls is very much requires for long-term investment and access to a steady supply of diverse genetic resources, right? When we look those issues in small-scale farmers, especially in developing countries, for them such kind of issues are very, it has become an economic dilemma, and for them. So the most for them, especially again for them, the most profitable decision in agriculture is frequently to grow only a few crop varieties and not to invest in conservation of varieties that are less favored by the market. So this is the way the challenges faced by the farmers, right? So in the case of when you talk about genetic diversity, as we know that farmers who maintain in situ crop genetic diversity, they are essentially conserving a global public good, and so this farmer can be seen as a net subsidizer of modern agriculture and food consumers worldwide, right? But unfortunately, the global institution, we're talking about different institutions, they are not in place to provide compensation of compensation for generating some global benefits, means the benefits given by those farmers. Because of that, the net result is that global crop genetic diversity is rapidly being reduced, since the custodians of the global genetic portfolio are not compensated by current international market. And as we know, there are no corrective policies or mechanism in place in most of the countries of the world. So that's why we're facing a lot of issues. This is one of the challenges in managing agrobiodiversity. The process we are following in the last few decades is transition from traditional to intensive agriculture. We know that nearly half of the world's population there lives in rural areas and depends directly on agricultural systems. It is estimated that approximately about 60% of the world agriculture that consists of traditional subsistence farming system, in which there is a high diversity crop and species grown such as polycropping, intercropping, that exists in this traditional subsistence. That traditional subsistence farming system. It's very common if you go into any of the Indian mountain region, especially in Himalayan areas, you will find out such kind of practice. So this system, if you look to this that traditional farming system, it encompasses an enormous amount of the planet's agrobiodiversity, but we are not able to document it properly the species composition of such kind of subsistence farming, traditional subsistence farming system, and its function, means from ecological point of view, ecological function of that. But few organizations already working towards the direction. Then again, when there is low output of those traditional farming system, and and we are looking towards modernization of agriculture. And this modernization in agriculture is mainly due to many factors, including, we know that there is rapid population growth, breakdown of this traditional institution, and stronger market force. This is more important, stronger market forces that exacerbated by the role of agribusiness in international trade pressure. So, looking from that, when we are coming from traditional to intensive agriculture, there is an immediate effort. We must make to conserve the biodiversity, human knowledge from this traditional ecosystem, so that it is available for solving agricultural problems, not only now and in the future also, and to support human society. That when we talk about human society, most of the time we rely on our cultural services provided by our environment. So agriculture intensification, expansion of agriculture, we know that all these adversely impact the biodiversity on and off farm, thereby promoting species extinction, menace, and constricted wildland habitats. And when we abandon targeted lands and desertification is happening, and agriculture encroachment on forest margin will also be increased because of agriculture intensification. This again further loss of agrobiodiversity, biodiversity and its services, right? Coming to when we are talking about intensification of agriculture, we know that we are adopting a number of genetic engineered crops. What are the impact of those the adoption of genetic engineered crops and agrobiodiversity, means managing the agrobiodiversity? We know that the majority of the world's plant genetic resources is located in tropical and subtropical regions, and in this area, primarily small farmers, they preserve and take care of these resources, means biodiversity, and also the related agricultural diversity. As we see that genetically modified crops have also been cultivated in this tropical and subtropical region, and we can say across the world from the last 2 to 3 decades, and estimated that 40% of the global acreage transgenic, that 40% of the global acreage of transgenic, that is genetically modified crop, they are to be found in developing and emerging countries, and in fact almost exclusively in just 6 countries: Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Paraguay, and South Africa. Now in this area, concentration is very high in this particular area, and that 4 crops account for 95% of all these transgenic varieties planted, that are soybean, maize, cotton, and canola. The purpose of cultivating this crop, especially the genetically engineered crops, are for industrial purpose or animal feed. In the same time, we know that genetic engineering has accelerated the industrialization of agriculture, and so amplified the negative impact of farming on biodiversity. In addition to that, there are new and unknown risks because of that. The integration of genetically modified plants into non-transgenic varieties and races, they poses a potential threat that is currently, we are not able to predict what is the possible, potential threat, but that have longer impact. Again, agricultural genetic engineering sometimes, most of the time, actually justified with the argument that it can achieve a quantum leap in intensification of agriculture and accelerate breeding of variety. But if you look into that, most of the time we find that there limitation is higher than benefits. And if you look into most of the progress, what we have seen in plant breeding, like yield potential, drought resistance, salt tolerance, most of all these, plant breeding is achieved by our conventional methods only. We know that biodiversity is a strategic resource for the future, and therefore there is therefore indispensable common property, right? So intensification of agricultural productivity must not proceed at the expense of biodiversity, but we must try to harmonize with the biodiversity, right? In both economic and ecological terms, if you look into that agricultural genetic engineering, that crops we are using, if you look from that economic and ecological terms, this agricultural genetic engineering, they does not stand better than other innovative technology that promote agricultural intensification. In fact, that methods like marker-assisted selection, that integrated pest management and organic agriculture are more in line with aims of sustainable intensification of agriculture. So we can look at the impact of genetically engineered crops from a technical aspect, then monopolization, monoculture, when you talk in related to agrobiodiversity management. So when we talk about technical aspect of adoption of genetically engineered crops, we have seen that as of now, last few years back, we have 2 genetically induced traits that have gained commercial importance. One is herbicide tolerance in crops, and pest persistence through insertion of gene from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis, that's BT. We talk about in the BT cotton, right? These 2 genetically induced traits that is very much important when we talk about commercialization, commercial importance of the genetically engineering crops, right? So these traits that have been introduced to maximize, agricultural production by countering the effects of herbicide and pest. So the effect of these traits on agrobiodiversity, now when you look into what is the effect on agrobiodiversity, it's not favorable. We know that, as I told you, introduction of GE crops is, if you look into benefit and limitation is higher. That means that have negative, most of the time, negative impacts more than that. So number of studies says that these traits have been neither ecological viable nor economically profitable in long run. And when we talk about herbicide tolerance, this herbicide tolerance is seen to have an effect on biodiversity, like the case of Argentina, that soybean, plantation, transgenic soybean plantation in Argentina, that was started in 1990s. So the introduction of this, the transgenic soybean varieties in Argentina has enormously accelerated a trend that already existed. Right? That's in front of us. So large scale expansion of monoculture cultivation of soybeans in that Argentina, right? So the plants are resistant to the herbicide glyphosate that allow fully mechanized production, require less agricultural skill than conventional variety. But within 10 years, that 1994 to 2004, the acreage under soybean has increased from 6 to 14 million hectares, and the share of transgenic soybean in the fields from 0 to 99%. So still the Argentine government at the time aims to increase acreage by another few more millions hectares, when we are getting those benefits, in the same time we are not able to understand that impact of in our agrobiodiversity due to that monoculture. Again, when we talk about BT technology, BT technology is used to produce transgenic plants, like as I told you, in India we're talking about BT cotton, right? For example, in BT cotton, it has a BT toxin in its DNA. So most insects that eat BT toxin, they die, making chemical pesticide, and that unnecessary. We need not to apply chemical pesticide, right? So, but based on the experience with the BT cotton, in the early years, it was very promising. But if you look into different studies, it showed that pesticide use are substantially reduced, elevating damage to insect fauna, decreasing cost of production, improving net income. That was what was happened in the beginning of that way started to use that BT toxin, right? In some of the studies, they have found that only BT technology is not confined to positive result. If you, for example, some studies in China, the researchers found that the majority of the farmers had to treat their cotton field 15 to 20 times more often than in the early years growing BT cotton to kill secondary pest, and particularly like particular species Miridae. So now, because of that, farmers spend same amount of pesticide as neighboring non-BT growers, in addition to having to pay about 2 to 3 times more for BT seed, right? So impact you have seen first. In the beginning, here it was quite promising. It was very effectively, that benefit. But after later, after 2-3 years, then it has limitation was shown evidence in front of those farmers. So that has the direct impact to their economic as well as the environmental impact in that area. Same case, some study in South Africa also. To sum up, we can say, based on current knowledge, the impact of BT technology on biodiversity is at base, that has limitation with only few benefits. We know that in the same time, when we look into genetically modified crops, that this also leads to contamination of indigenous crops by cross-pollination. When transgenic plants, when we release this to the environment, from the greenhouse, they may cross-pollinate with other varieties and with wild relatives. So this pollination is irreversible and difficult to limit regionally. So sometimes, their pollen grains of such crops are found up to more than 20 kilometers away from where it had been cultivated. So this makes the coexistence of transgenic crops with non-transgenic crops, which is virtually impossible. That's why the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization advised all international agricultural research scientists to do whatever possible to avoid unintentional transgenic introgressions into their ex situ gene bank of collection. But how to deal with those issues is a greatest challenge to us. Then coming into, when we're talking about GE crops, we know that monopolization and monoculture is happening when we introduce GE crops. And when we talk about monopolization and monoculture in this particular issues of GE crops, now you feel that there has been unparalleled concentration in the seed sector that is responsible for commercial breeding and propagation during the last few years, especially last 3-4 decades. For example, in 2006, over half of the global seed market was supplied by only 10 seeds corporations. As far as we look into transgenic crops are concerned, the market is cornered by just one company. Most of us know that is Monsanto, right? That provides seed directly or indirectly for approximately 90% of the total area under transgenic crops, right? In fact, biotechnology has not caused a monopolization of seed sector, but it has accelerated and reinforced the process. One main reason for this is that the breeding costs of GE crops are extremely high and the necessary investment can only be borne by larger companies. Conversely, to cover this cost, a standardized variety or a whole cropping technology has to be distributed as widely as possible. So, this development, if we develop such kind of development, creates dependency among farmers and leads to genetic uniformity of cropping system that are already reported in the United States, where farmers said that it has now become virtually impossible to find high quality conventional varieties of corn, soybean and cotton seed. Another consequence is the increasing control of genetic resources by few companies through patents, licenses and so on. So in the past, we have seen that genetic material for breeding purposes was in the public domain. Today, it has increasingly become private property, accessible only with the permission of patent holders. So this gives them have a strong influence on breeding programs and strategies and on maintenance of varieties. Today, the concentration in the seed sector is probably the greatest threat to the diversity of agricultural crops. In terms of, if you look from national economy, this drastic change to the land use and farming system due to adoption of genetically modified crop may be initially this drastic change in land use may be positive, but it has had a negative impact on food production and diversity of cropping system. For example, in case of Argentina, rice and the potato cultivation has suffered a reduction of 40%, 38% respectively. So even higher lows have been observed with vegetables, and a similar trend has been observed with products such as milk, eggs and meat. So the mixed farming system practiced by smallholders are gradually disappearing and are being replaced by large monocrop fields. So we need to look for a sustainable agriculture, and there we need to talk about all of agrobiodiversity. So to combat all this adverse impact of agriculture intensification and expansion, we need to have a transition into transition towards sustainable agriculture, which is that kind of agriculture that will offer for the long term satisfy human food and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality and natural resource base upon which the agriculture economy depends, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources and on-farm resources, and integrate where appropriate natural biological cycles and controls, sustain the economic viability of farm operation, and enhance the quality of life of farmers and society as a whole. If you look at biologically, there is much potential for increasing utilization of agrobiodiversity for sustainable agriculture. Crop biodiversity can clearly enhance nutrient use efficiency and a diverse soil community that may govern tighter nutrient cycling, and control pest and disease and improve soil structure. Right, ecological research, when we, that has already shown that biodiversity can increase the productivity ecosystem. So, in the structure of agricultural landscape, that is mosaic of agriculture and non-agricultural ecosystem, that is widely recognized now as one of the important for the utilization and conservation of both on-farm and off-farm biodiversity. So the challenge is to find a way to meet our immediate needs for food, fuel, and fiber while we are conserving sufficient biodiversity to assure our capacity to respond to climate and anthropogenic environmental change. Moreover, to alleviate poverty in a rapidly growing world population using a finite set of rapidly eroding biological assets, we need to be able to identify the threats involved in alternative land use much more effective than has been done in the past. So this requires a scientific approach that is driven by human needs, that recognize interdependence between human behavior in ecosystem process and delivers a deeper understanding of the role of biodiversity in satisfying those needs. So when we understand all these things, the need is we need to integrate that ecological value and the economic perspective about agrobiodiversity. So for an economist, when you talk about agrobiodiversity, it is a part of natural capital and the flow of service that it provides in the is the interest on this capital. Just like as investors choose a portfolio to produce capital to maintain the return on capital over a range of market risks. So society needs to choose the mix of genes, species, communities, and ecosystem to maintain the flow of ecosystem services over a range of environmental and social risks. So in order to design agricultural development conservation policies that maintain an ecological acceptable and economically optimal level of biological diversity in agricultural landscape, an understanding of risk implication of changes in the mix is very much required. So economic can offer insight for decision makers by identifying the social opportunity cost that result from agrobiodiversity loss. So such kind of opportunity costs have to do with the complex threats of among food production, biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, and human well-being. Right. So economists have shown how investment in agrobiodiversity reduces both environmental and market risks faced by agricultural producer and so enhance well-being. But the economic value of changes to enhance agrobiodiversity in its services is rarely reflected in most of the current market transaction and is not taken into account by decision maker. In many countries, users of biological resources in agro-ecosystem have little incentive to maintain sufficient diversity to meet the needs of agricultural production because the market for agricultural inputs and outputs do not reflect the full social opportunity cost. So economists refer to this as the problem of market failure, and to the resultant loss of agrobiodiversity is an external effect of agricultural markets that creates excessive social costs. So ecological economics, the new areas which however offer potential solution to such policy dilemma. So this ecological economics calls for evaluation of all environmental cost and benefit associated with different modes of agriculture, and thereby they can succeed to identify the relative economic benefit associated with maintaining high agrobiodiversity. So still we need further research to address all these issues, integrate economic value of the ecological value into economic terms. For example, by identification of the key functional roles played by biodiversity with evaluation of possible scenarios for improving the management of this key function in agro-ecosystem in response to environmental economic stress. Resilience, for example, appears to be a useful concept which can be integrated in this system, right? And then the basic is as a ecologist in economics, we have to understand we realize that biodiversity has a number of functions which contribute to the resilience of agro-ecosystem. When we resilience the agro-ecosystem, automatically they have direct or indirect impact to the production system. So that's we need to understand from that ecological principle into as an economist, right? So today we have what we understand from this session is that we know that the growing pressure on agricultural landscape is leading to agricultural intensification, modernization of agriculture due to many factors also impacting on agrobiodiversity, and genetic engineering has accelerated the industrialization of agriculture, thus amplify the negative impact of farming on biodiversity. So in this session, what we learn is about the current pattern of economic development and agrobiodiversity, how we transit from traditional to intensive agriculture, and what are the impact of adoption of genetic engineering. Now we are looking for sustainable agriculture, and that we are looking for the role of, or appreciate the role of agrobiodiversity. To appreciate, to change, to make whatever the changes necessary in this particular era of climate change is the integration of ecological economic perspective about agrobiodiversity. Thank you.